Now you might want to say that in a case like Ralph's, and let's assume that Ralph is not aware of the pervasive sexism in his behavior. You might say in a case like that, there's no lack of authority about what one believes. Ralph believes that men and women are equally intelligent, you might suggest. He just doesn't act on that belief. But I think that's an overly linguistic and intellectualist view of belief. Our beliefs are what guide us not just in what we say, but in what we do. They animate our limbs and not just our mouths. They're also manifested in our spontaneous emotional reactions and in our implicit assumptions. Now, I don't think it's quite right to call Ralph, as I'm imagining him here, simply an out-and-out sexist who straightforwardly believes that women are intellectually inferior. What Ralph says and how he reasons in his most abstract and thoughtful moments is an important part of what he does, even if it's only a part. Ralph's attitude toward the intellectual equality of the sexes is what I'd call an in-between state. His dispositions, his patterns of response, his habits of thought are mixed up and inconsistent. It's neither quite right to say that he believes in the intellectual equality of the sexes, nor quite right to say that he fails to believe that. But the point here, there's no specially privileged self-knowledge he has about that fact. Many people profess to believe in God and heaven. Here again, I think we have a case in which sincere linguistic avowal often comes apart from behavioral manifestation and spontaneous response. To believe in God, in the mainstream monotheistic sense, is in part to believe that there's an omniscient agent who's always observing you, with the power to reward you with eternal bliss or condemn you to eternal torment. Many people who sincerely, verbally espouse the existence of such a God, and I don't mean hypocrites here, I mean people who sincerely, verbally espouse it, fail to act and react in their daily lives as though such a God exists. They'll do before God what they would not do before any neighbor, even the most forgiving one. And only human eyes and human condemnation will give them the pinch of fear and remorse. Such people are, I think, like Ralph the sexist. But rarely do they think they are. If you take yourself to believe in such a God, and if your behavior is less than saintly, you should be terrified about the state of your faith. I say I value family over work. When I stop and think about it, it seems to me vastly more important to be a good father than to come and give talks like this one. Yet I'm off to work early, I come home late. I take family vacations and my mind is occupied with some journal article. I'm more elated by my rising prestige than by my son's successes in school. My wife rightly scolds me. Do I really believe family is more important? Or I sincerely say that those lower than me in social status deserve my respect. But do I really believe that if I don't act that way? My attitudes, my beliefs and values especially, are not so much what I sincerely avow when the question is put to me explicitly, but if they're rather what's reflected in my overall patterns of action and reaction, in my implicit assumptions, in my spontaneous inclinations, then although I may have pretty good knowledge about the simple and the trivial, or the relatively narrow and concrete, that is, what I think about April's weather, the attitudes that are most morally central to my life, the ones that characterize me as a character, the ones most crucial to my self-image, those I tend to know only poorly. How about other features of my mentality? My personality traits, my moral character, the quality of my philosophical work, my overall intelligence. My own view is that traits of this sort are structurally very similar to attitudes. Personality trait attributions, skill attributions, attitude attributions can all be seen as shorthand ways of talking about patterns of action and reaction. And our degree of self-knowledge is roughly similar. Our self-knowledge is pretty good about narrow and concrete matters, especially when the attribution is normatively neutral in the sense that it doesn't tend to cast me in a good or a bad light. It's also pretty good when there are straightforward external measures. I know I'm good at Scrabble. That's pretty narrow, concrete, measurable. I know I'm more interested in business news than in celebrity gossip. Just look at what part of the newspaper I read. Now, of course, there's a whole industry in psychology based on a self-report of personality traits. It generally works by asking people medium-sized questions about traits or attitudes. Do you like to go to parties? Do you go out of your way to meet new people? If you say yes to questions like this, then you get called an extrovert. No, an introvert. They find patterns in people's responses to such questions. Those patterns are generally fairly stable over time, and they have some degree of relationship, extroversion may be one of the best cases, to actual outward behavior. However, self-evaluations tend to break apart from outward behaviors, explicitly measurable, and also from peer evaluations, when the traits in question are evaluatively loaded. And most personality traits really are evaluatively loaded to some extent. Even extroversion is generally given something of a positive weight. So it's okay to like parties. It's kind of okay not to like them. Self-evaluations, peer evaluations tend to line up. Maybe also external behavior, but not evaluations like being flexible or being lazy. In fact, Oliver John and Richard Robbins found a tendency for self-attributions and peer attributions to correlate negatively for some traits. People whose peers, for example, judge them to be relatively ignorant, undependable, unfair, or lazy, were actually less likely to describe themselves as relatively ignorant, undependable, unfair, or lazy than were people whose peers did not attribute to them those vices. Right? Undependable people think they're dependable. Now, perhaps the most generally evaluatively loaded trait attribution is simply whether one's a morally good person. How well do we know this about ourselves? I'd guess that there's approximately a zero correlation between people's actual moral character and their opinions about their moral character. Plenty of angels, but not all, think pretty poorly of themselves. And plenty of jerks, but again, not all, think they're just dandy. So if you think pretty well of yourself, it's probably just about as likely that you're actually a relatively good and admirable person as that your overall moral character is below average. It would be really nice to have some empirical data on this, but people are just too wily. I suspect our habit, the habit of most of us at least, and certainly me, is to assume that we're pretty decent people, above average in moral character, maybe not saints, but pretty decent guys, right? And then defensively reinterpret and rationalize any counter evidence.